It's time to get the breakdown started. 1, 2, 3. First up, 10 observations.
Just took his guy and just boom, put him right on the ground.
It's first and 10. Number 1.
We are going to have to multitask this year, which I realize is something that is really much more my job than it is your job as a fan. You don't have a job as a fan. You root, you're emotional, you're invested. That's why we care about sports. We love sports because it lets us ride this roller coaster, and there's only so much real consequence on our lives. Obviously, there's tremendous consequences for, say, Cade York, who no longer has a job, in case you're just tuning in. He got cut this afternoon. But at the end of the day, if I'm going to try to be smart with my analysis, I'm going to have to do two things. I'm going to have to evaluate each game as it comes, and I'm also going to have to try to give some context on the bigger picture of what is happening in the rebuild. Is there anything that gives us pause? Is there anything that makes us go, whoa, okay, hold on. We're directing ourselves towards some kind of North Star, and it seems like we're off a few degrees. And truth be told, in the honor of Tell the Truth Monday, yesterday's game isn't really positive in either. In the context of the game, it was worse than I thought the game would be. In the context of the rebuild, it was a really bad start because the stated short-term goal is to establish a play style, to play fast, to play physical, to not have the kinds of communication issues that have plagued, say, the secondary and other parts of these teams, or this franchise and its football teams for a long time. And they failed on a lot of those fronts yesterday. However, I think it's important context to say that Dan Quinn knows that. He's not going to lie to himself about it in the way that previous coaches and executives here and even owners have, and they're going to get back to work to fix it. And so I think that we have to, again, multitasking is going to be something that we have to do a lot this year. That does not mean in my saying like, hey, there's no reason to freak out about the long-term direction to get your, hey, Josh Harris needs to sell the team, Adam Peters needs to get fired signs out. That would be utterly ridiculous. It's been one game, but that game was not good. And it was not good because they didn't do one of the biggest things that they claim to preach.
Number 2.
They have finished Fridays in Ashburn. They didn't have a finish Sunday. The third down defense was, can I say, I think I can say this. I'm gonna put up this on the screen on YouTube. And I'll say a previous or an alternate version. We're looking at the right there part. I don't know if people can read that, but it says the third down defense was booty. That's how we're gonna describe that. You simply cannot exist in a world where you force that many third downs and then give up that many. All in all, there were 15 total plays that were run. There were 17 third down scenarios. There were a couple of penalties, so a couple of those plays get wiped off. By the NFL's NFL Pro website, I got 9 of 15 were 3rd and 6 plus. Most of those were converted. It wasn't good. And they did it in all kinds of ways. It was bad execution. It was poor discipline. There was poor discipline in terms of play style and coverage. There was poor discipline on the first third down of the game. They get a stop. And there's okay enough coverage. Like Forbes does enough to make it a difficult throw. Baker outruns or outthrows McMillan. A great throw. It's maybe a touchdown, so not exactly perfect. But none of it matters because Cleveland Ferrell gets an illegal use of hands because he gets up underneath dude's face mask and chucks him in the chin. Later, you got a too many men penalty. It would have been 3rd and 11. It's 3rd and 6 instead. And then Mike Sanders still gets lost in traffic, and they get a conversion because it's a lot easier to run that route concept on 3rd and 6 versus 3rd and 11. Not finishing in terms of pressures. And, yes, there's issues in coverage, but there's a lot of this where they're asking the coverage based off the amount of blitzers and pressures coming to hold up for, 2.5 seconds, and hey, we're going to get home. They did not. John Allen missed a couple of different sacks. Deron Payne had a couple of potential opportunities. Frankie Louvu had at least one off the top of my head. Bobby Wagner, I believe, had an opportunity at one point to get a sack or to get a pressure and couldn't finish. So it's just a lot of lack of discipline, lack of execution, and it comes in a game situation that you just need to be straight up better. if you have any remote chance of winning in this league. And it's actually why I appreciate what Dan Quinn said after the game, because he was asked about discipline, and because he had said last week, like, oh, if we're the more disciplined team, we're going to win. And someone was like, well, you had the equal number of penalties, and you had no turnovers, which was the equal. So did you think you were the more disciplined team? And Dan was like, no.
Yeah, discipline will win it, right? That's what I said. I thought it probably goes further than that. Discipline can also mean holding the right leverage, in a coverage. It can mean, the right gap sound. So I'd say it can probably expand bigger. But sometimes one thing compounds the next. And so when the time of possession, for instance, is that out of whack, I think that's directly correlated to third down. And they were probably close to 70%, and we were about 25%. So it wasn't like one team just controlled the ball on first and second down. There were, third down was a big part of this. So I didn't feel we were, out of whack of penalties. We had one that looked bad, blocking back towards the goal line on the long play. But it probably goes deeper than just, penalties and that, probably the whole thing through.
By the way, that penalty on Olamide Zaccheaus, the crackback block or whatever they called, that call sucked. That call was terrible. That call was so soft, so weak. He barely touched him, and they were well out of the play at that point. Anyway, that's not the point. I should be more disciplined and stick to the talking points. The point is, they didn't finish yesterday, especially defensively, and within the context of that game, more than anything else, and we'll talk more about Jayden, and we'll talk about BSJ, and we'll talk about Forbes, and we'll talk about all the individual guys and some of the other stuff as we roll on here in 1st and 10. But number one, we have to multitask. Two, within the context of yesterday's game, finishing and the lack thereof, specifically on third down, is the absolute biggest thing. However, before we get into some of the other stuff from the game, I do want to say this.
Number 3.
I have not lost 1 ounce of faith in the plan because I still trust the people in charge. And I realize for a lot of you today, you're like, that looked like everything I've seen before. And boy, let me tell you, it sure did. Your eyes were not lying to you. But what did change, what was different than the Rivera era, what's different than the Bruce Allen era, is what happens next, what happens after the game. It's not a mopey Jay Gruden at the podium being like, oh man, I can't believe, or he just is like looking at the play sheet being like, these plays work on paper, why can't I get anybody to execute them? It's not the Ron Rivera thing where he's chasing a million narratives and doing whatever the heck he did at post-game press conferences. It's Dan Quinn getting up there and being like, yeah, that wasn't very good. And there's a lot of lessons to take out of these games and this game. And if we do not take those lessons, then this wasn't worth it. If it is, or if we do take those lessons, then we can look back on this as a point of growth. It's that kind of mentality that actually rallies a building together that makes you able to string together good performances over time. This team is tremendously undermanned, and I think that was on full display yesterday in areas that we're going to talk about, some of which we knew. And by the way, that's the other part of this. I cannot tell you on a Wednesday, Thursday, Friday going into a game, hey, this could happen, this could happen, this could happen. It could all be bad. And then all those 3 things happen, and then me get in here on a Monday and go, oh my God, how did that happen? We know how it happened. So why am I going to sit here and pretend otherwise for shock value or whatever the heck other people do when, I'm not saying on our station or on the Fan or whatever, but we know it happens, and maybe it even happens here sometimes. But I'm not going to do that. That's not my show. That's not me. That's not how I do this. This is going to require patience and discipline. That doesn't mean that they get a pass for everything. We're going to hit on all of those things that don't get a pass next. But it does mean some stuff we're just going to say is bad, acknowledge it, shrug, and move on. Because realistically, this is a team with some off-season problems because it was impossible to fix everything that was wrong with this roster in one off-season, which is all this group has had.
Number 4.
In the short term, yesterday, we saw a lot of what I would expect in a Washington-Tampa game in week 1. And this is where, like, talking about the short term and the long term run headlong into each other. Cornerbacks, yeah, we all knew that could be a problem. Mega exacerbated yesterday. Godwin's an all-pro. Evans is an all-pro who's going to the Hall of Fame. And they had their way. There's just too many times that they are in man coverage, and like you can't not play man. I mean, I guess you could, but you have to then try to guard them in zone. And sometimes when you're in zones, you have to kind of latch on to guys and actually, cover them. And there was in both man and zone situations yesterday where Chris Godwin was just better than Mike Sainer still. Where Mike Evans was better than Benjamin St. Juste, where both of them were better than Emmanuel Forbes, where Jalen McMillan was able to manipulate space and coverage, and guys like Quan Martin are lost a little bit. Jeremy Chin not necessarily covering the amount of ground. Like, Chin was pretty quiet yesterday. So from the DBs, but specifically the CBs standpoint, I knew that it was going to be a trouble. I'm only judging them so much on yesterday, but I want to talk about Forbes and St. Juste separately in a moment. But ultimately, young talent, worth finding out if they were any good when they inherited them, because you weren't going to be able to get really good outside corners in free agency to sign here or take them with the draft picks because you had to spend those draft picks in other places. Same was true in wide receiver. I think they needed more from not Terry McLaurin yesterday. And yet, I don't really fault Adam Peters for the state of the wide receiver room because Jahan Dotson was supposed to be a part of it. And when Jahan Dotson didn't play well in training camp, they were like, oh, crap. Well, this sucks. Let's trade him and make sure we get a pick that we can use to maybe replace him next year. But what are they supposed to do? And you can be like, trade for Brandon Ayuk. And I would tell you, you're drunk. That wasn't on the table. So, they anticipated 2 first-round picks being the head of their receiving room. One of them wasn't very good. It's not their fault. They didn't draft him. They got draft capital for him. So some of this stuff, and then the last, I would say some of the stuff you could anticipate. And then the last thing that I would say you could have anticipated is real life harder than fake life, a.k.a. Jayden Daniels having to read a real Todd Bowles defense versus the vanilla stuff that he got to read in the preseason. Very different. And I will tell you, I want more preseason reps for this team next year. And yes, you are allowed to remind me of that if I say otherwise next August. Okay, let's do it. Let's talk about Emmanuel Forbes.
Number 5.
If I were to say I'm not giving up on Emmanuel Forbes based off this performance, you're going to ultimately get mad at me and not listen to anything else I say. I'm going to ask you to listen to everything else I say because I'm not giving up on Emmanuel Forbes after this one performance, but he's got about a 1 week more leash. Because before the double penalty play, the play that ultimately gets him benched. Now, there might have also been an injury situation, apparently, but he did not play again after the big play where Jalen McMillan ran into him and he got the face mask and the PI. That was Emmanuel Forbes' last play, and whether he was benched or injured doesn't really matter. Before that play happened, I wrote down in my notes, he's not playing hard enough. That's a deal breaker. That's a no-no. You can't. It's one thing to get beat. It's one thing on technique. And there's a couple plays in the game where, like, he's right where he's supposed to be and, guys make good plays and even the kind of short passes that they're willing to give up because, hey, we just don't want to get beat deep on the explosive stuffs. Fine. Okay. But you can't not put your body in there in the run game. You can't kind of let the tackle come to you. No, you go hit somebody. You can't not be physical enough at the point of attack. Like, there's some stuff in this game where Emmanuel Forbes does not stick his nose in and get stuck in the way that Dan Quinn and Adam Peters and Joe Witt Jr. and Tommy Donatel and staff up and down, the coaching staff to the front office expect you to play to be a Washington Commander in 2024 and moving forward. And if that's not going to happen, you got 1 week to turn it around. And if you're not going to turn it around, you're going to be on the bench or you're going to be on another team. And so when I say I'm not willing to give up on Emmanuel Forbes after one bad week, he started camp poorly and he turned it around and he really played well late. So if he had an off day yesterday, he wasn't feeling right, whatever. I'm giving you one more do-over. And then we got to have a talk. And I realize for some of you, he's 17 games last year. Last year doesn't count. Last year was as poorly managed of a rookie season for a first rounder as you can get. That position was horrendously coached. His confidence was shot. And by the way, that carried over to this game. And that's something they're realistically going to have to deal with. They're going to have to find a way to reach him and be like, hey, dude, you're good. Go be good. Because you could see him on some of the stuff where he gets beat, where he just starts to hang his head and his body language is terrible. And you're just like, man, that doesn't work at that position. You have to have the memory of a goldfish. And so for Forbes, yes, there's bad technique. Yes, there's bad mental mistakes. Yes, there's bad, whatever technical stuff that we can talk about with many corners across the NFL. But it's the effort and the attitude and the approach that need to get fixed. Otherwise, he is not going to be long for here. And that's stuff that I had down in my notes before the big penalty where all that stuff came together in cataclysmic disaster.
Number 6.
Benjamin St. Juste is a different story. He was stuck in. He was competing his face off. He just didn't do the right stuff. Unfortunately, that's been a bit of a habit for Benjamin throughout his career. But again, if he can understand it and fix it, and it gets better week over week, and he's not getting punished to the level that you get punished when you make those kind of mistakes against Mike Evans, future Hall of Famer, well, there might be a salvageable player there because eventually, hopefully, he's not CB1, he's CB2. And I thought this from Dan Quinn was super interesting, kind of on that ability to go, hey, what's lost here? What's got messed up here? And I do think the contrast he's drawing, even though he won't say it, I will, is the way Benjamin got beat versus the way Forbes got beat.
Yeah, we just rotated people around, and I think it comes from a place of competing and knowing how to, and knowing when to make the right decisions into those spaces. And so that's what we'll work on. Technique-wise, usually you ask a player, what'd you see? And if they know how to correct it already, then you're in a good spot. And that was Ben on the first touchdown to Evans. I need to turn the other way. I need to look, okay, you got it. If you ask a player, I don't know, that's a bigger concern. And so those guys know the things they need to work on, and that's why it did sting. And there's a lot for us to work on. But third downs, Nick, I would say collectively defensive. I wouldn't put it on one versus the other.
You hear him say, we asked Ben, he's got it. He knows what he needs to do. For instance, he turned the wrong way on that first touchdown to Evans. And I actually was watching the tape and I stopped and I was like, let me go listen to Quinn's press conference. I'm wondering if he was asked about this. And he said it and I was like, that's what I thought. I love being right. But more importantly, right, BSJ is actually in good position, in good phase. He's where he's supposed to be, but he turns the wrong way, and that means he can't find the ball. On the second one, he actually is the right way. He tries to play through the hands, and he just whiffs, and he's got to actually make a play. Again, finish. That's what he's got to do, but you can live with that, and if you do not finish perfectly against not Mike Evans, the consequences aren't so severe. Forbes, however, it feels like they asked him, hey, man, what do you got to do? What's wrong? And he was like, I don't know, man. And, well, that's why he didn't play anymore.
Number 7.
I can't believe it took us to number 7 to get to Jayden Daniels, but it took us to number 7 to get to Jayden Daniels. The first half was much more scramble-filled than the second half. And of those scrambles, I think I had 5 marked down in the first half. I would say definitely 3, if not 4 of them, were actually the correct decision by Jayden. Coverage was there, pressure was coming, some combination of those. 2 of those, Wiley got beat inside. He was pretty good the rest of the game, but he got beat on 2 in the first half, and Jayden has to get out immediately. There's a couple other ones where it's like, okay, you can get out here, but you could also check it down later in the down, like let's escape to pass. And then in the second half, different story. Second half was a completely different offensive structure, everything. And I felt like he missed a couple of big opportunities. And that's a little more worrisome. But also, again, it's a rookie quarterback trying to figure out Todd Bowles' defense. And he got flushed a bunch in the first half. So he's probably a little bit trigger shy / scramble happy. So I think that he has obviously tremendous ability. We see the athleticism. He turns negative plays into explosive plays. That alone is an invaluable skill as a scrambler, but clearly he's got to be able to do it better from the pocket. I do think that what he'll see next week and moving forward for most of this season will be far easier to do that against than a Todd Bowles defense in your first start.
Number 8.
Terry's day. I'm sure that we're going to get some talk about Terry and Tell the Truth Monday. Here's the truth about Terry McLaurin. He very easily could have had 5 catches for 150 yards and 2 touchdowns yesterday. Jayden missed him on the obvious one on the first play of the second half. He just overthrows him. That's a 70-yard touchdown. There's another 65-yarder that Terry is screaming wide open. Jayden's looking right at him, and I have no idea why he does not throw that football. It's a dagger, and he wins, and I don't know. There's a couple other targets in the game that are well designed for Terry, and Tampa was basically like, there is no way in hell that dude is beating us on this play. So I actually didn't hate the Terry plan, although I would have liked to see a few more force feeds to Terry, a jet sweep, a screen, and I would like to see that happen early in the game because he's a tone setter. That said,
Number 9.
I think Cliff Kingsbury's not asleep at the wheel. I saw adjustments. I saw stuff that made sense. I saw stuff that made me happy. Yaya Dubin's giving everybody hell in the first half. So let's go make sure that we have a tight end or a back to go chip him. One of the first big plays in the second half, Austin Eckler gets one hell of a shoulder into Yaya Dubin on a chip. Throws off his whole rush. I love that. Let's be smart with our protection. Let's try to get the ball out a little bit quicker. Let's use our quarterback run game. And if you want to talk about an offensive coordinator that's trying to give you a freaking spark, in the first drive of the third quarter, first play, they go deep to Terry. They did the direct snap where Jayden lined up and shotgun over the guard, try to create an explosive run. They threw the ball deep to Terry again, and they had that throwback play where Luke McCaffrey should have thrown it back to Jayden Daniels and decided for whatever reason not to. If he throws it back to Jayden, that thing's probably a house call because there is like 3 Bucs on that side of the field and about 5 Commanders blockers. That was, it had to be a lateral because it was a forward pass, but that's how the play was set up. Man, that sucks. But Cliff was trying. Cliff was in his bag, and they just couldn't generate the explosives, in part because the players didn't execute. It's not Cliff's fault Terry got overthrown. So I like the fact that we have an offensive coordinator who's, awake.
Number 10.
And then last but not least, this we'll have to get into more later because we're over time, but there's a lack of cohesion defensively, both in coverage and communication, and in how they're playing pass rush lanes and rush lanes up front. They have got to get that cleaned up and just be smarter. Like if you're a Daron Payne and you're a defensive tackle, and you have a defensive end next to you that is playing a wide split, like he's way outside where the tight end would be, you can't jump inside on a run. That gap is way too big, and that happened multiple times for big plays for the Bucs. So it's those types of details that you got to get locked in, cut down on some of the freelancing on defense, and then obviously the communication and cohesion on the back end that we're going to have to talk about a lot more as the week goes.
This is the Hoffman Show on the Team 980 and the Odyssey app.